Joel Osteen built the biggest church in America on a simple message of hope. For 25 years, he smiled through every storm, every scandal.
On a Sunday morning this August, a camera pointed into the sanctuary of Lakewood Church in Houston, Texas, and what it captured told a very different story than the one Joel Osteen has spent 25 years telling the world. The building holds close to 18,000 people. On that morning, barely a quarter of the seats were filled. For a church that once claimed weekly attendance north of 45,000 across all its services, an arena that size sitting mostly empty is not a small detail. It is the kind of image that spreads fast, gets clipped, gets shared, and gets asked about. Was the summer slump to blame? Was this just an off week? Or is something bigger finally catching up to the largest church in America? To understand why that empty sanctuary matters so much, you have to go back to where this all started, because the story of Joel Osteen was never really about one man. It was about a family, a feed store, and a father who built something out of almost nothing. Joel Scott Osteen was born on March 5, 1963, in Houston, Texas, the fourth of 5 children born to John Hillary Osteen and Dolores Dodie Osteen. Long before Joel ever stood behind a pulpit, his father had already built the foundation of everything that would come after. John Osteen was born in 1921 in Paris, Texas, and became a Southern Baptist minister while still a teenager. He built real academic credentials along the way, earning degrees from John Brown University, Northern Baptist Seminary, and later a doctorate from Oral Roberts University. His path to ministry was not simple. He had been married before, and that marriage ended in divorce while he was pastoring a Baptist church in Baytown, Texas. He later married Dodie in 1954, and together they began building the family that would eventually become one of the most recognized names in American religious life. Everything shifted in 1958, when the couple's newborn daughter Lisa was born with a condition resembling cerebral palsy. That crisis reshaped John's entire outlook on faith. He described experiencing what he called a baptism of the Holy Spirit, and from that point on he moved away from traditional Southern Baptist teaching and embraced a more charismatic style of Christianity. That shift led him to leave the Southern Baptist Convention altogether, and on Mother's Day in 1959, he founded a new congregation in a converted feed store on the edge of Northeast Houston. About 90 people showed up to that first service. It was rough, small, and unremarkable to anyone watching from the outside. Nobody could have guessed that decades later it would become the largest church in the United States. Joel grew up watching that congregation expand year after year, but he was not the child anyone expected to inherit it. He graduated high school in 1981 and enrolled at Oral Roberts University to study radio and television, but he left after a single semester and came home to Houston to help build his father's television ministry instead. For the next 17 years, Joel stayed almost entirely behind the camera. He learned production, directed broadcasts, and helped grow the technical side of the ministry, but he consistently turned down invitations to preach. His mother preached. His sister Lisa preached. Joel simply did not see himself as a pastor, and for nearly 2 decades, nothing suggested that would change. Then, in January 1999, everything shifted in the span of a single week. John Osteen had been struggling with heart and kidney problems, and once again he asked his son to step in and preach a Sunday sermon. Joel initially said no, the same answer he had given for years, but this time, within minutes, he changed his mind. On January 17, 1999, a nervous 35-year-old Joel Osteen delivered his first sermon to a congregation of around 6,000 people, while his father listened from a hospital bed. 6 days later, on January 23rd, John Osteen died of a heart attack. The timing left Joel shaken. He later described it as feeling almost impossible to explain, the idea that the last Sunday of his father's life happened to be the one where he finally stepped up to preach. Joel's siblings, meanwhile, had already scattered into very different lives of their own. His brother Paul became a surgeon in Arkansas after graduating in the first medical school class at Oral Roberts University. His sister Lisa survived a pipe bomb mailed to the church in 1990 and went on to become an associate pastor at Lakewood herself. Another sister, Tamara, married a pastor, and the youngest, April, became a motivational speaker and author in her own right. Joel was, in many ways, the least likely of the five to end up carrying the family name into a new generation of leadership, which is part of what made the sudden transition in January 1999 feel so unexpected to people who had known the family for years. What followed was not an easy transition. Joel initially tried to preach the way his father had, with the same intensity and structure, and it did not work. It took months before he found his own voice, one built around encouragement, optimism, and practical hope, rather than traditional doctrinal preaching. That shift changed everything. Under Joel's leadership, Lakewood's growth accelerated at a pace that outgrew its own building almost immediately. By 2001, the church struck a deal with the city of Houston to lease the former Compaq Center, the arena where the Houston Rockets had played for decades before moving to a new downtown venue. The numbers involved were staggering for a religious institution. Lakewood committed to tens of millions of dollars in prepaid rent, spent roughly $95 million on renovations financed through a bank loan, and opened the doors of its new home in July 2005 to a crowd of around 56,000 people. Years later, in a deal that drew its own share of criticism, the city agreed to sell the building to the church outright for a fraction of its value. By December 2023, Lakewood had fully paid off the construction loan, a milestone Joel announced from the stage. As the church grew, so did Joel's personal brand. In 2004, he published his first book, Your Best Life Now, which became a runaway bestseller, spending more than 2 years on the New York Times list and eventually selling millions of copies worldwide. That single book transformed Joel from a regional megachurch pastor into a national figure. More books followed in steady succession over the next 2 decades, several of them also reaching #1 on bestseller lists, and Joel built one of the largest media ministries in the country, with broadcasts reaching an estimated 100 million households and an online following in the tens of millions across social platforms. Altogether, Joel has published more than 24 books since that first release, ranging from broad self-help titled works to more scripture-focused devotionals, with new titles continuing to appear well into 2025 and 2026. His publishing deals have reportedly included advances in the multi-million-dollar range, figures that would be extraordinary for almost any author, let alone a pastor whose primary platform began as a regional television broadcast. That publishing success is part of what allowed Joel's ministry to expand so far beyond the physical walls of Lakewood. His sermons are broadcast on major religious networks and carried in more than 200 television markets across the United States, and his weekly messages are translated and distributed to audiences in more than 100 countries. In recent years, Joel has also leaned into newer media formats, appearing on popular podcasts aimed at younger, more secular audiences, framing his message of positivity and resilience for listeners who might never otherwise tune into a televised church service. In 2005, Joel made a decision that became one of the most talked about details of his public image. He announced he would stop taking his salary from Lakewood Church entirely, choosing instead to support himself through book royalties and speaking engagements. It was framed as a gesture of humility, evidence that he was not preaching for money. But it also had the effect of shielding one of the largest sources of his personal income from the kind of scrutiny that a public salary figure would invite. His estimated net worth has been reported in various places at around $100 million, though independent fact-checkers have noted that many of those figures circulate without clear primary sourcing. What is easier to verify is his real estate. In 2010, Joel and his wife Victoria purchased a roughly 17,000 square foot mansion in Houston's River Oaks neighborhood for just over $10 million, a property that has since been valued considerably higher. The home is held through a trust, which means the family does not qualify for a standard homestead tax exemption, and property taxes on it run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. That gap between personal wealth and public accountability has fueled years of criticism. Because Lakewood is a registered church, it is exempt from the financial disclosure requirements that apply to most nonprofits, and watchdog organizations that track ministry transparency have repeatedly given Lakewood some of the lowest scores in the country for financial openness. Reporting from major outlets has estimated that only a small fraction of the church's roughly $90 million annual budget goes toward outside charitable causes, with the vast majority reinvested into the ministry's own operations, media production, and facilities. Financial scrutiny is only part of the story, though. Joel's family has been at the center of public controversy in ways that have nothing to do with money. In December 2005, his wife Victoria was involved in an altercation aboard a Continental Airlines flight from Houston to Colorado. According to federal aviation reports, a dispute over a stain on her first-class armrest escalated into a physical confrontation with a flight attendant, delaying the flight by more than 2 hours. The Federal Aviation Administration fined Victoria $3,000 for interfering with the crew member. The flight attendant later filed a civil lawsuit seeking damages, and the case went to trial in 2008. After a short deliberation, the jury ruled in Victoria's favor, and the matter was closed, though it remained a fixture of tabloid coverage for years afterward. Theological criticism has followed Joel just as persistently as financial and personal controversy. Scholars and fellow pastors across the evangelical world have been sharply divided on his teaching style, which emphasizes hope, self-improvement, and positive thinking over traditional doctrinal preaching about sin and judgment. Critics have argued that his messaging softens or sidesteps core Christian teaching in favor of something closer to a self-help philosophy dressed in religious language. Some of the most pointed criticism has compared his preaching unfavorably to what they see as a more consumer-driven, feel-good version of faith, arguing that it prioritizes comfort over substance. One prominent theology professor described Joel's approach on national television as treating Scripture the way a fortune cookie treats a proverb, pulling out short, comforting lines while skipping over anything that might make a congregation uncomfortable. Another well-known pastor from a rival ministry went even further in public remarks, questioning whether Joel's teaching could be considered biblical Christianity at all, and suggesting that a message built so heavily around personal success and financial blessing risked distorting the core of the gospel rather than illuminating it. A separate critique, published in book form by the head of a Christian apologetic organization, argued that Joel had become the most visible face of a broader trend in American religious life, one that reshapes faith into a tool for achieving personal goals, rather than a call to sacrifice or humility. Joel has generally responded to this criticism with the same calm, even tone that defines his public persona, arguing repeatedly that there is nothing wrong with giving people hope, and that his critics misunderstand the purpose of his ministry. He has pointed out on multiple occasions that his sermons are not meant to replace deeper theological study, but to meet people, many of whom are already carrying heavy burdens, with encouragement rather than additional guilt. That even temperament was tested in a very public way in 2005, when Joel appeared on a nationally broadcast interview and was asked directly whether people of other faiths, including Jews and Muslims, were condemned without belief in Jesus Christ. Joel hesitated, said he was careful about making that kind of judgment, and avoided giving a direct doctrinal answer. The response spread quickly and drew heavy criticism from more traditional evangelical voices who felt he had dodged one of the most basic questions in Christian theology. Days later, Joel posted a public statement clarifying that he believed eternal life came only through Christ, calling the moment a learning experience. The controversy never fully disappeared, and it became one of the most cited examples critics point to when questioning the depth of his theology. The most damaging period of Joel's public career, though, came in 2017, when Hurricane Harvey struck Houston and dropped more than 60 inches of rain across the region, making it one of the costliest natural disasters in American history. In the immediate aftermath, Lakewood posted that its building was inaccessible due to flooding, directing displaced residents elsewhere. Almost immediately, people began circulating photos and videos appearing to show the area around the church dry and reachable, and questions exploded across social media about why one of the largest, wealthiest churches in the country was not opening its doors to help. The backlash intensified over the following days, even as Lakewood explained that its parking garage had flooded and that floodgates in the building had been activated as a safety precaution. By the third day after the storm, Lakewood did open as a shelter, and volunteers helped house several hundred people, but by then the narrative had already taken hold. The contrast with Houston furniture store owner Jim Mackingvale, widely known as Mattress Mac, who had immediately opened his stores to evacuees, only deepened the criticism aimed at Joel. In media interviews defending himself that week, some of Joel's comments, including remarks about how the story might have looked different if the building had flooded while sheltering people, struck many viewers as tone-deaf rather than reassuring. He later acknowledged that in hindsight, he would have prepared the building for shelter use before the storm ever hit. The Harvey controversy did not fade quickly. In the weeks that followed, commentators and public figures across the country weighed in, using Lakewood as a symbol in a much larger debate about the wealth of American megachurches and their obligations to the communities around them. Some public figures came to Joel's defense, including entertainer Tyler Perry, who donated a portion of his own hurricane relief contributions directly to Lakewood and publicly praised the Osteen family. But the defense did little to change the broader narrative that had already formed. A sermon Joel delivered a few weeks after the storm, in which he suggested that God believed Houston could handle what had happened and that residents should stop being upset about something they were capable of enduring, drew fresh criticism from people who felt the comment minimized the very real suffering many families were still living through. Years later, Harvey remains one of the most frequently cited moments when critics want to argue that Joel's ministry prioritizes image management over substantive action. Strange stories have continued to follow Lakewood well beyond Harvey. In March 2014, the church reported that roughly $600,000 in cash and checks had been stolen from its safe following a weekend of services. No suspect was ever identified, and the church collected on an insurance claim for the loss. More than 7 years later, in November 2021, a plumber working on a bathroom at the church made an almost unbelievable discovery. While repairing a toilet, he found hundreds of envelopes stuffed inside the wall, containing cash, checks, and money orders. Houston police later confirmed that evidence connected the discovery to the original 2014 theft report, though by that point the statute of limitations had expired, meaning no criminal charges could be filed. Church officials speculated that whoever had hidden the money originally intended to retrieve it later, only for it to fall out of reach inside the wall cavity. The plumber who found it was awarded a reward from a local crime tip organization, and the story became one of the more bizarre footnotes in Lakewood's history. It also raised uncomfortable questions that were never fully answered publicly. Chief among them, how large sums of cash and checks were able to sit inside the walls of a public restroom for 7 years without anyone noticing, and whether the church's internal handling of large cash donations needed tighter oversight going forward. No changes to those internal procedures were ever detailed publicly, and the case quietly closed once the statute of limitations passed. Financial controversy resurfaced again during the pandemic. In 2020, as churches across the country shut down in-person services, Lakewood applied for and received more than $4 million in Paycheck Protection Program funding, one of the largest such loans issued to a Houston area organization. The news drew significant public backlash once it became widely reported, with critics questioning why a church with Lakewood's financial resources needed federal relief funds intended to help struggling small businesses and nonprofits stay afloat. Church leadership defended the decision as necessary to continue paying staff salaries and benefits through an uncertain period, but the pressure eventually led Lakewood to announce it would repay the loan in full rather than seek forgiveness. Then, in February 2024, tragedy struck Lakewood in a way no amount of controversy over money or messaging could compare to. A woman with a documented history of severe mental illness entered the church carrying a rifle and opened fire in a hallway between services. 2 off-duty law enforcement officers working church security responded and shot her, ending the threat, but not before her 7-year-old son was struck and critically wounded, along with a bystander who was treated and released. The child underwent multiple surgeries and suffered permanent injuries. In the aftermath, it emerged that the shooter had been able to legally purchase the weapon despite a documented history of mental health crises, reigniting national conversations about mental illness, gun access, and security at houses of worship. Joel spoke to the press in the immediate aftermath, visibly shaken, acknowledging how much worse the outcome could have been. The shooting forced Lakewood to confront questions it had never had to answer before, about how a church built to welcome tens of thousands of strangers every week could also keep them safe. In the months that followed, the church quietly expanded its security presence, adding more trained personnel and screening measures at entrances that had previously operated with a much lighter touch. For a ministry whose entire public identity had been built around openness, warmth, and an almost radical accessibility, the shift toward visible security checkpoints marked a quiet but undeniable change in what walking into Lakewood on a Sunday morning actually felt like. Some longtime members have said publicly that the atmosphere inside the building has never fully returned to what it was before February 2024, even as the church has worked to reassure its congregation that it remains, above all else, a place of safety and welcome. Which brings the story back to this August, and to that half-empty sanctuary. Lakewood's own reported attendance figures, if taken at face value, would require every single service the church runs each week to be running near full capacity just to hit the numbers the church has claimed publicly. Video circulating this month suggests that is simply not what is happening on the ground. Whether it reflects a genuine decline in the church's core audience, a broader shift in megachurch attendance nationwide, or simply the usual late summer dip that most large congregations experience, is not entirely clear yet. But the optics are difficult to ignore for an institution built so heavily on the image of scale, momentum, and unstoppable growth. Joel Osteen has weathered nearly every kind of controversy a public figure can face. Theological criticism from some of the most respected voices in evangelical Christianity. Accusations of financial opacity from watchdog groups and major newspapers. A wife's courtroom battle that played out in the tabloids. A hurricane response that briefly turned him into a national punchline. A cash discovery so strange it sounds invented, except that it happened, and police confirmed it. A pandemic loan controversy, and a mass shooting inside the very walls of his church that could have ended in far greater tragedy than it did. Through all of it, the same calm, hopeful tone that made him famous has remained his defining public trait, and his critics and defenders alike have never quite agreed on whether that consistency is a strength or a mask. There is also a broader context worth considering, one that goes beyond Joel Osteen or Lakewood specifically. Across the country, in-person attendance at many large churches has been trending downward for years, a shift accelerated by the pandemic and by broader changes in how younger generations engage with organized religion. Streaming services, on-demand sermons, and social media clips now let millions of people experience a church service like Lakewood's without ever setting foot inside the building, which raises a genuine question about whether an empty sanctuary in 2026 actually reflects declining interest in Joel's message, or simply reflects a changing relationship between audiences and physical attendance. Lakewood's own numbers, drawn largely from self-reported figures rather than independently audited attendance counts, have never been easy to verify from the outside, which is part of why moments like this one, a single piece of video showing rows of empty seats, tend to spark so much public debate. It is difficult to separate genuine decline from the normal seasonal dip that most large congregations experience every summer, and difficult to know whether Lakewood's online audience, which still numbers in the tens of millions across platforms, tells a more accurate story about the health of the ministry than the physical building does. What happens next for Lakewood Church is not something anyone can predict with certainty. 25 years ago, a nervous man wearing his late father's shoes stood in front of 6,000 people and, almost by accident, found a calling he had spent his whole life avoiding. He built that calling into the largest religious platform in the country, a media empire, a publishing dynasty, and one of the most recognizable faces in modern American Christianity. Whether that empire is now entering a genuine decline, or whether this is simply one more chapter in a story that has survived every previous storm, is a question only the coming months will answer. For now, the seats that used to fill within minutes of the doors opening are sitting empty, and for a ministry built almost entirely on the image of unstoppable momentum, that silence may end up saying more than any sermon ever could. Whether Joel Osteen spends the next chapter of his career rebuilding that momentum or simply managing its slow decline, one thing has remained constant through every controversy so far. He has never stopped showing up, week after week, with the same message he has delivered since the very first Sunday he ever stood behind that pulpit.